The Galactic Conclave Summit Hall on Valuri's Prime was a masterpiece of alien architecture, crystalline spires rising into a violet sky, corridors carved from luminescent stone, and air that smelled faintly of rain and ozone. Delegates from 47 species had gathered here, all of them wearing the practiced expressions of civilizations that had long since learned to coexist through carefully negotiated treaties and mutually assured economic destruction. Valeth Aruna moved through the crowd with the grace that had made her famous in 3-star systems. She was Aelhuri, tall, silver-skinned, with eyes the color of storm clouds and bioluminescent markings that pulsed softly along her temples when she was thinking deeply. The youngest senior diplomat the Aelhuri sovereignty had produced in 2 centuries, she was known for her ability to read a room, to sense the weight of unspoken politics, and to navigate the treacherous currents of interstellar negotiation like she was born for it. Which, her colleagues often joked, she was. Walking 2 steps behind her, as he always did, was Ethan Cross. Ethan was unremarkable by the standards of most species in attendance. Medium height. Dark hair kept short and practical. Skin tone a warm brown, slightly weathered. He wore the standard charcoal gray uniform of the Diplomatic Protective Corps, with no insignia beyond a small silver pin at his collar. His eyes were a quiet, steady brown that seemed to absorb more than they reflected. He didn't fidget. He didn't scan the room in obvious sweeping arcs like the bodyguards of lesser diplomats. He simply existed in the space behind Valeth Decalm, unhurried, always exactly where he needed to be. The other delegates' security details noticed him, of course. They always did. Something in the way he stood, balanced, economical, without a single wasted angle, made experienced fighters instinctively catalog him as a potential threat and then feel slightly embarrassed that they'd bothered. Valeth had worked with Ethan for 14 months. She trusted him completely. She had, however, never asked where he was from. It had seemed unnecessary. Humans were thoroughly catalogued. She knew the basics: bipedal, oxygen breathing, moderately short-lived, emotionally complex, diplomatically unpredictable. They had spread to a handful of colonies. She had assumed he was from one of the nicer ones. The incident began during the 3rd day of negotiations, in the smaller antechamber reserved for informal conversations between delegations. Valeth was attempting to broker an agreement between the Keth Dominion, insectoid, territorial, deeply suspicious of perceived weakness, and the Mervani Collective, whose hive-mind representatives communicated in overlapping harmonics that made most other species instinctively want to leave the room. The Keth lead negotiator, a creature called Scareth, had the size of a ground vehicle and the temperament of a wounded predator. He'd been maneuvering the conversation toward a position that would, if Valeth let it solidify, essentially coerce the Mervani into a tributary arrangement dressed up as a trade deal. She was carefully dismantling his arguments when the door opened without announcement. 3 members of the Dravery enforcement bloc entered. The Dravery were not officially attending the summit. They were, diplomatically speaking, observers. In practice, they were the hired muscle of 4 of the summit's most powerful delegations, creatures standing nearly 3 meters tall, with exoskeletons the color of dried blood and secondary arms built specifically for close-quarters pressure. The lead Dravery, a male called Varek, whose reputation preceded him across several systems, walked directly to the center of the room and stopped. "Ambassador Aruna," he said, his voice carrying the specific kind of quiet that was louder than shouting. "The delegations she represents have concerns about her continued participation in these negotiations. They request that she withdraw." The room held its breath. This was not a negotiation. This was a warning delivered in polite language, backed by 3 species worth of physical intimidation. Every other being in the antechamber understood exactly what it was. Valeth felt the familiar cold clarity of high-stakes pressure settle over her. She straightened. Before she could speak, Ethan stepped forward. Not dramatically. Not aggressively. He simply moved from behind her to beside her, a slight repositioning, less than 2 meters, and the change in the room's atmosphere was immediate and difficult to explain. Varek's eyes dropped to him. The Dravery's secondary arms spread slightly, an unconscious display. "Stand aside, human," Varek said. Ethan looked at him with those quiet brown eyes. "No," he said. One word. Flat. No heat in it. No performance. Varek leaned forward slightly, letting his full height become apparent. "Do you understand what I am?" "Yes," Ethan said. "Do you understand what I am?" There was a pause. Varek's mandibles clicked, a Dravery expression that translated roughly as amused contempt. "You are human," Varek said. "A soft species. Young. Brief-lived. You are." "I'm from Earth," Ethan said. The words landed like a stone dropped into still water. Ripples moved through the room in silence. One of the Mervani harmonics cut off mid-phrase. Scaritha's compound eyes rotated. The two Dravery behind Varek exchanged a look that Valeth, even with all her diplomatic training, could not fully read. She watched Varek recalculate. She found herself doing the same. Valeth had, like most educated beings in the galaxy, a cursory knowledge of Earth. She had assumed it was simply the name of the human homeworld. An unremarkable planet. The details had never seemed relevant. They became relevant now, watching Varek's posture change. Earth. Class 4 Deathworld, by the Galactic Biodiversity Commission's classification. A planet where the fundamental pressure of life was so extreme, so unrelentingly competitive at every level, microbial, ecological, atmospheric, geological, that the organisms which survived had been forged into something categorically different from the life that had evolved on more gentle worlds. A world with apex predators in every biome. Where the weather itself could kill. Where the flora was frequently toxic, the fauna frequently hostile, and the oceans concealed things that the GBC xenobiologists had spent decades classifying and still found unsettling. A world where the dominant species, humans, had climbed to the top of that particular nightmare through a combination of persistence, social coordination, tool use, and a stress response that, rather than triggering paralysis, triggered problem solving. A world where human children played in rain. Sought out the dangerous animals out of curiosity. Found the planet's more lethal environments interesting. Valeth had read the GBC report once, years ago. She had filed it under academic curiosity and moved on. She looked at Ethan now with new eyes. He was standing in front of 3 Dravery enforcement soldiers, beings whose home planet was itself a Class 2 biosphere, who had been raised in a culture that treated physical intimidation as a primary social language, and he was bored. Not performing calm. Actually calm. The way a person is calm when the thing in front of them has not yet entered the range of things they consider genuinely threatening. Earth, Varek said again. Slowly. Yes, Ethan said. The silence stretched. Valeth had attended negotiations that lasted 4 days and produced less information than the next 7 seconds. Varek looked at Ethan's hands. At his posture. At the particular absence of fear in his face, not bravado, not aggression, just baseline. He looked at the 2 Dravery behind him. Some unspoken calculation happened. Then Varek straightened. The concerns of the represented delegations, he said carefully, can be submitted through the standard diplomatic channels. He paused. We will leave you to your discussions. He turned. His 2 companions followed. The door closed behind them. Scaritha's mandibles clicked several times in rapid succession. The Mervani resumed their harmonics at a slightly higher register. Valeth stood very still for a moment, processing what had just happened. Then she looked at Ethan. You're from Earth, she said. Yes, Ambassador. Earth. Class 4 Deathworld Earth. That's the one. She looked at the closed door. You could have mentioned that. The corner of his mouth moved slightly. You didn't ask. Valeth was quiet for a moment. She thought about the 14 months they'd worked together. The 3 assassination attempts they'd navigated. The time on Kethra Station when he'd walked through a firefight to extract her without apparent increase in heart rate. The way he'd once described a near-death experience as a little exciting. She thought about the GBC report. A species forged in catastrophe, capable of tolerating atmospheric pressures, temperatures, and physical trauma that would incapacitate organisms from gentler worlds. Their most notable adaptation is psychological, where most species' stress responses produce shutdown, humans produce focus. Are all humans like you? She asked. Ethan considered the question with genuine seriousness. The ones from Earth, he said, are pretty much all like this. Some of the colony-born are a bit softer. But the ones who grew up on Earth, he paused. You sort of stop finding things scary after a while. Valith looked at him for a long moment. I see, she said. Well. She turned back to Scarith and the Mervani representatives, straightening her posture. Shall we continue? Ethan stepped back into position, 2 steps behind, exactly where he was supposed to be. Quiet. Unhurried. Present. The room moved on. But something had shifted in it permanently, the way a room shifts when everyone in it quietly agrees that the balance of power is not where they had assumed it was. Valith negotiated the rest of the afternoon with the same precision she always brought to her work. She just negotiated slightly more confidently. The Keth Mervani trade agreement was signed 4 days later, without further interruption from Dravery observers. Ambassador Valith Aruna's official report noted exemplary conduct by her security detail. Ethan Cross filed no report. He rarely did. He was from Earth. It hadn't been that complicated.